Hello, patrons. We're going to kind of mix it up a little bit today. This is sort of an extension of a vlog I just recorded, which I may or may not put out because I sort of talked for a long time. But I want to talk about quality of light because I think that that's sort of something that's really a mystery when you're starting out a lot of the time. I know it was a mystery to me. You know, you go and sort of see these workshops or tutorials and see people pointing big lights at things, and you're like, well, I don't have a joker, so I don't know, sort of how to recreate that look. So what I want to do is sort of talk about what actually makes a look and how you can accomplish it as well. So I'm going to do my handy dandy Matt Workman build my own Photoshop slides here, and we're going to pull up some reference frames to sort of try to explain this. But I will warn you that, as always, I didn't really make a big plan for this ahead of time. So sort of the thing that I would start with is that this is something that I've been thinking about talking about for a while, but Steven posted something in the group tonight asking about a look, which is this frame, and said, want to figure out what the light is doing, and it's really simple, I would say, but it's not really simple when you're starting out because you don't understand how these things work. So I want to kind of start with the premise that, like, light is always the same, and by that I mean that, like, light has laws of physics to it. Oh, this is a cool font. So, when you're starting out, light seems like this very mysterious thing that you're like, oh, well, these different kinds of lights, and I don't know what they do, and all these different modifiers, and it's really pretty simple once you start to understand the rules. So I'm going to just stick with this font for now. Light is the same. Leave that at that. Light has certain things that affect, oh my gosh, why is that so far down there? Light has certain things that affect the quality of it, to say so. And so things that affect light quality. And by light quality, I really mean how light falls on something. When you see how something is lit, that's what I'm really talking about. So things that affect light quality. One, size of the source. So what does this mean? And this is sort of basic, so if you're a really good DP, this might seem basic, but lots of people don't understand this. So size of the source basically means that how big your light source is will determine how soft your light is, and that's really as simple as it is. It doesn't have anything to do with diffusion. It doesn't have anything to do with the kind of light. At the end of the day, any two lights that are the same size will be the same softness or the same hardness, however you want to call that. And I'm sure you're rearing up and saying, well, that's not true because of this, that, or the other thing. I have this light that is way smaller than this light and it seems harder. And so the thing that I would add is that softness and hardness, soft/hard, is determined by the size of the apparent, I missed an A, apparent source, excuse me. And so that seems to make it slightly more complicated. I'm going to change this font because it's driving me nuts. Okay, so the soft or hardness of a light is determined by the size of the apparent source. And so what that means is that the apparent source is whatever, wherever the light's coming from last, basically. And it's an apparent source in that it's how it appears to the subject that you're filming, basically, more or less, in this case of this example. So let's take a really simple example. The sun, we're going to try and pull a really quick reference here. The sun is a very hard source. You go out in the middle of the day, there's really hard edges to it. And so, well, let's first make a really simple example out of soft light. What we're talking about with soft light is something that has a very smooth gradation to it. There's no hard shadows or anything. And hard light does have hard shadows to it. And that's sort of what soft and hard means. Soft light is caused by big light sources. Hard light is caused by small light sources. The sun is a very big light source at the end of the day. But when we stand outside, because the sun's so far away, it looks small. Like, it literally just looks small to us is all I'm saying. And because it appears small to us, it makes harder light. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can sort of think about this, whether it's like, if you think of a shadow as like which part of something, like say this area on this girl's forehead can see the light source. If the light source is small, there's a very distinct line where like this bit of her skin can see the light and this bit of her skin can't see the light, and that's where the shadow is getting drawn. Or like even if you look at my face right now, this part of me sees the light that's up here, which is an aperture LS1/2. This part of me does not, and that's why there's this relatively sharp edge here, because it's a relatively small source. Now on the other side over here, I have a beadboard kind of bouncing back some tungsten light from my desk lamp, and it's making a soft source. You know, there isn't really a hard edge anywhere in here. It sort of fills in all the shadows. So sunlight on a person. We're going to test the depths of Google Images. Let's say direct sunlight. Yeah, I guess this is a fine example. So let's look at this lady. This lady has some very hard shadows, you know, bright here, darker here, line right over here, just lots of shadows. And that's because the sun is the main apparent light source out there. But it is a physically big source, but because it's far away, it appears small, and that's what makes that shadow. Now, what we see on the right could be a number of things, but for the sake of this example, I'm going to say that it's a cloudy day. So if it's a cloudy day, I'm just going to try them. Cloudy day photography. Cloudy day photos. Nope. Photo shoot. Cloudy day photography, a lot of people are into, especially when they're starting out, because you end up with really soft light. And what makes the light really soft, it's still coming from the sun, but the light is coming from the sun and it's hitting all the clouds. And then the light's coming from the clouds and getting cast below. And the clouds become the apparent light source, because to us they appear as the light source. Because we can't see the sun, we see the clouds, and the clouds are where the light's coming from. Now, the clouds go on for miles and miles, usually as far as we can see, and that's what makes the very soft fall off of the light. So sunlight is the source either way, but we're changing the quality based on the apparent light source size. So the same thing applies where if we have a hard light, say like a Fresnel or a little practical or like a work light that's a physically small source, you know, the bulb in a work light might be small and it's a hard edge. If we take it and instead of kicking it through a cloud, kick it through a diffusion, now it becomes like say a 6x6 apparent light source, and now it's soft as a 6x6 would be. No matter what light we push through there, whether it's a joker or a LED or a tungsten or a work light, it's all going to have the same basic apparent softness coming through that diffusion. The only thing that changes is if you have a very spotty source and it's only actually lighting up, like say the center 6 inches of the diffusion, then it's not going to be that soft, because only the center 6 inches is really throwing light and being your apparent light source, if that makes sense. So you have this softness, hardness thing going on, and that's all determined by your apparent light source. So that's why like kinos and quasars are usually pretty soft, because they're big physically, you know. That's also part of why I tend to not necessarily always have super soft lights, is because I can always make a soft light or a hard light softer by either bouncing it, where bouncing becomes the apparent light source, or by diffusing it. So the one sort of added note I would say by that is that diffusion diffusion is not softness. Now, that probably seems to contradict with what I just said, but let's try to look up a quick example on our friend Fresnel diffusion. Let's see. You'll usually find a picture of someone doing something like this. Which is basically throwing a piece of diffusion on a barn door of like a hard light, like a Fresnel or something. Now, that's not going to make your light any softer. And the reason is, well, it's hard to find a good picture of that. And the reason is because the apparent light source size is more or less the same. It'll do a little bit in this case because presumably, you know, your light source becomes maybe this, like, we'll call it 6 inches as opposed to this like 3 inches, but it's not making a significant difference. What the diffusion is doing is it's changing your beam angle, where the diffusion is literally diffusing light. It's scattering it laterally up and down, left and right, and pushing it all around the room. And it's probably hitting the walls and stuff. and then it's coming back because those walls now all become part of your apparent light source. So it's not making that original light softer, but it can be used to make the general light in the room softer, so to speak, by bringing your contrast levels more into line. But the actual like edge isn't going to change a whole ton. So that's where diffusion, I think, gets confusing to people. And one other thing that I think is important to note is that certain kinds of diffusion, like let's see if we can get a picture of half soft frost. I'm not going to make any bets. Let's say something like, this is an okay example. So this is a diffusion called half soft frost, and it's a pretty light diffusion. It looks sort of just like wax paper or something. It's not really heavy like a silk if you've ever used a silk. So the difference is that, like, say you have a silk, it's always going to appear as like the whole piece of your beam that's hitting that is filling the silk is at more or less the same level, and it becomes like a 6x6 source. Something like a half soft frost, you're going to get this hot spot like you can see right here, and I don't know if this is actually half soft frost. This actually sort of looks like the bottom of an ultra bounce, but whatever, for the sake of the argument, you'll get this hot spot, because it's not as thick a material, where you can see through the material and see your original hard source, assuming you're punching a hard source, or say we're using the sun. You'll see the sun and it'll be brighter than everything else. So you'll get the sun coming through at, whatever, say a 5-6, you have a certain amount of light coming through the sun. But the sun is also casting a wide enough beam that there is light hitting the rest of your frame, and the rest of your frame is throwing light too. So you're going to have this duality of a hard source sort of in the middle of your diffusion or wherever you put it, but then that soft source that's like a stop or two below is lifting up all those shadows a little bit. So that's sort of one of the things that, like, different diffusions, at the end of the day, that's usually what you're dealing with. There's not a whole lot of magic to it aside from just how much it's scattering light, how much light it's knocking down, and sort of like how the light fills the frame. So different fabrics sort of respond differently, and some people can sort of get a little picky about that. So diffusion is not softness. Diffusing your light does not make it softer, but it will spread it around more and change your beam angle. 3, brightness is relative. And so what I mean by that is that our exposure is always relative to something. So brightness in a light is pretty self-explanatory. Depending on how bright or dark it is, that's going to affect how things play. But let's say, I'm trying to find a good example in here. Let's take this as an example. I don't think I shared the other behind the scenes pictures from this, unfortunately, and I don't know where they are now. So we're just gonna have to deal with this. So you have a situation like this, where if you saw the original breakdown, which if you didn't, you can go back, it's on Patreon. This stage was normally lit by all these like stage washes, and it was a very bright stage. Like if we exposed for the stage, it was bright everywhere, and it was just really flat and really boring. So what we could do in this situation is we expose the camera down like a stop or two. So we bring everything darker. Let's say we turn our aperture up, we turn our shutter speed, whatever we want to do, put some ND in, and we make everything darker. So let's say that this was the ambient light, and now we bring everything down so that in the camera it looks darker. Now we have these quasar tubes, and we can sit the quasar tubes like a stop or two above everything, and now we've added this contrast where the rest of the room is darker, but these guys have stayed the same level, so we've now brought them up above the exposure. So this same principle applies if we're like lighting an interview or something. Let's say let's say we're lighting almost there. Dang it. Let's say we're lighting one of these interviews. We could expose for the guy, and so we walk into the room, don't light anything, point the camera at him, expose for him, and the outside is super, super bright. But what we want to do is we want to bring those levels sort of within the range of the camera. So the first step that I usually do is expose for the thing we can't control. So like we can't change how bright it is outside, obviously. So I'm going to set my exposure for the outside and what I want the background to be at. And then if you know, if you're metering things, you can do this with a meter too to get a sense of where you need to be, but it's really as simple as we set our brightness for the outside, and then we bring in our lights and push in as much light as necessary to bring him into where we naturally want him to be in that exposure. So sort of figuring out where you want levels to be is all about like, well, you know, if we start to understand the apparent light sources, how those light sources are falling as far as where they are relative to the camera and stuff, then we can start to say, well, I need this part of him where this light is falling to be brighter than the outside or about the same as the outside. So, you know, that's what we're going to control. So brightness, I don't know. I feel like brightness is pretty self-explanatory. Here's another example. So this is a shot with a window in the background exposed with no lights on. So we're exposed so that there's detail sort of in this whole background window area. You know, it's not blown out. And then we turned off all the indoor lights. And so this is sort of what we're left with. Then we punch a key in here. And basically key is our main light. Key is this guy, and it's a light mat, which is a bigger, softer source. We move it in close to get it nice and bright and nice and soft, because the closer something is, the brighter it gets as well, and the softer it gets. The further it is, the darker it gets, and the harder it gets. So we push it in, we get this sort of look, and then we're like, well, we like this, but we sort of wish this part wasn't so dark. And so we push another little light just bouncing in off the right to get a soft fill, just filling in those shadows. Sometimes you want a soft fill, sometimes you want a hard fill, and it's really just a matter of recognizing what you like. So softer, harder, bigger, smaller, you know, the further we are, the harder the source, the closer we are, the softer the source, the closer we are, the brighter the source. If you're not getting enough output, you can always try to get your lights as close as possible, and if everything's super bright, you back it away, but it's going to get harder. Color temperature is always relative to your exposure. So let's say that like this shot, the outdoors is probably about 6,000 Kelvin. So our key light, and this is a Joker, bounced off an 8x8 ultra bounce, which just means that we have this 8-foot wall of light coming back basically, and that's why it's pretty soft here. And we pushed a little bit warmer and white balanced for the little bit warmer sort of, you know, we're probably white balanced right around 56 actually, but this is playing a tiny bit cool, this is playing a tiny bit warm, but we can control that. So if we want a tiny bit of like orange blue shift, we can put camera at say 5,000, put one set of lights at 43 and one set at 56, and we have, you know, that couple hundred Kelvin on each side. If we want a harder push, we set the camera to 4,300 and then lights at 32 and 56, and that sort of slips us into a further blue, further orange relative sort of thing. So that's just sort of something else you can consider. And I always white balance relative to sort of the feeling that I'm looking to get. And that's another thing you just get by looking at stuff. And so then, you know, sort of the inverse of that is negative fill. So let's say in this frame, you know, there's some cloudy sunlight coming from mainly from the far side of these guys, which is what's making this, you know, edge where the light is falling. And I tend to always put my key lights on the far side of my talent because it makes this nice edge where it's brighter here, darker here. And say it's like a overly cloudy day and it's just really flat, you can always take anything that's going to not reflect light or knock down light, like a black floppy or negative or just anything you can get your hands on that won't reflect light. And you can put it in there and it's just going to knock down some of that light that's all bouncing around, and it's going to bring in that darkness, and it's going to help give you shape. Now, shape of light is something that I'm going to save for a separate video just so that this video doesn't get too long. Brightness is relative. White balance is relative. White balance. My camera's about to die, so let's try and get this done. Is relative. 5. What's the last thing I would say? I think that's pretty much the main stuff right now. I'm going to leave it at this for now. So if you have any questions, leave them below. Oh, and then one other thing, Matt Workman has a video on grids. You can look up grids. Basically, a grid just controls something from spilling. And if you think about that, it's because say you have like a 2x4 light mat or Westcott Flex or something, you know, sort of anywhere you can be in the room, you can see the light source, and so light is getting thrown at you. Now, if you put a grid on it, when you're standing right in front of it, you can see the whole thing, but as you move off the axis, you're going to stop being able to see it because you're on a weird angle to the grid, and that's why it stops the light from going that way. And so a grid can be used to control things like that. So yeah. think that's my quick run through on lighting quality. I'll do part 2 if you guys are interested in it, but I sort of want to hear what you think, get some questions that I can follow up on and stuff. And I just want to know if this kind of thing interests you guys. So then we can sort of talk about shape and stuff, how different lights fall, and sort of how I think about actually lighting something. But I wanted to get the terminology and sort of premise for it down. So thank you guys so much for your support. As always, tell your friends. We're trying to really get a little more momentum on this thing, just to make it less stressful for me, honestly, because it's just a lot of work. But I super appreciate your support, and hopefully this is helpful. Excuse me. So I will talk to you guys next time.